8:37 exactly, and we're now joined by Patrick Deale. He is a Labour lawyer and mediator at Deale Attorneys. To answer that very big question, obviously, and that question is, can your boss or your employer force you to be vaccinated against COVID-19 if you don't want to be vaccinated? One of the anti-vaxxers, for whatever your reasons are. How serious is the situation? And if the employer does force you, or is there a situation where he can actually work you out of your position? Patrick Deale, morning. Welcome to the program.
Morning, Julia. Thanks. Good to be with you, and good morning to your listeners.
Lovely to have you on the show. Is this a very sticky situation, or is it really very simple, cut and dried, and, easy to implement and move on? So I don't want to be vaccinated for whatever reason. Can my employer either fire me or force me to take the vaccination? And I suppose he has a whole host of reasons, maybe a threat to other workers or whatever else he puts on the table.
Yes, Julia, just in short, it may be possible for an employer to terminate the employment of its employees who refuse to vaccinate if the employer has introduced a mandatory vaccination policy, and it has done so after it has gone through a number of processes. And it can terminate, if it has done that, for operational reasons, as you suggested, to secure the health and well-being of the greater good or the greater number of employees as a priority over individuals. So effectively, that is the state of play. And there are a number of factors to determine as to whether or not an employer has taken the right steps and if a mandatory vaccination rule is legitimate, that it can implement and that it can use to then proceed with a dismissal. And we can go through those together.
Okay. Now let's look at the employer. What steps does he have to take to introduce this policy in his workplace? Would it be dependent on the number of employees he has on board, the type of industry he's in, and whom would he engage? Someone as yourself, Patrick Deale, a Labour lawyer, would they interact with you to get them to put the policies in place? I mean, I should imagine he can't just make an arbitrary ruling in this respect and inform his employees that as of today, this is the policy going forward.
Yes, certainly. There has to be a process and it has to be fair, and perhaps good advice on how to go about it may be a good idea. But there are a number of factors, and the process, let me say, is a convergence of existing labour legislation on the one hand, and particular legislation or regulations to do with the protection of our nation in response to the COVID pandemic. And so we have to associate those two together and see what the outcome is. In relation to the general principles that already exist in terms of the LRA and other legislation, there are two principal acts that come into play here. The first one is the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which makes it mandatory for employers to take care of their employees while they're in the workplace. The employer has an overall abiding duty to provide a healthy and safe working environment. And the Health and Safety Act makes that compulsory. And what it does in normal circumstances is that it requires an employer to assess the risks to the health and safety of their employees and to come up with a health and safety plan. Every organization must have a health and safety plan. That health and safety plan is done in consultation with the employees. Consultative processes are required. Where unions involved, where internal structures are involved, that must be fully canvassed. And the health and safety plan must, after the assessment, put in the plan to mitigate the identified forms of risk that may exist. So that's the existing state of play. COVID comes along and it introduces a whole new dynamic to the existing set of risks in the workplace. And obviously the type of risk and the severity of risk depends on the particular workplace. So if you're working in an office, the set of risks is entirely different as if you're working in a chemical factory, for example. So in the case of COVID, we're talking about a disease and something that can affect every individual, and against which the state has introduced a plan or a vaccination program to mitigate it at a national scale, let alone at a company scale or an employer scale. So it's a question of marrying those two together. So what the regulations, the Department of Employment and Labour did, it published regulations, particularly dealing with this point that we are dealing with now. And this was a direction published in the Government Gazette on the 11th of June 2021. And it set out how the employers should manage COVID in the workplace, and particularly whether or not they are going to make a decision or create a policy as part of their plan, their health and safety plan, to implement a mandatory vaccination. And that is what is the requirement. It was supposed to be done within 21 days of the publication of the direction, obviously because the threat is ongoing and growing. And so that time period, that 21 days, in fact, lapsed on the 20th of July 2021. I'm not sure how many companies have done this. Many companies actually might not have known about it. But the fact is, in the risk assessment, it stipulates several factors which, particularly to whether it's going to amend its existing health and safety plan to add mandatory vaccination or not in relation to the prevention of COVID. And some of those operational requirements which they will consider are, whether employees operate remotely, or whether there's adequate workspace in the particular workplace to accommodate social distancing, whether people work close together or can be separated, and whether, sensitization measures could be put into place to encourage behaviors of employees to protect themselves against COVID. Also, the supply of personal protection equipment, and also the prevalence of COVID in the particular workplace. So some of those are some of the operational factors which the employer would put in place to determine whether there are operational risks and to what extent those risks are severe, to what extent they can try and cope with them or accommodate them without making mandatory vaccination.
All right, two final questions, Patrick. And the one is, can you just expand on this? It says certain employees may also face dismissal for incapacity where they cannot perform their jobs properly without vaccination. That's a bit vague to me. What exactly is the suggestion here?
It is a bit vague simply because there's a kind of a fusion on the one hand of the employee's rights not to be vaccinated, and in that sense put him or herself at risk in the workplace because the person may be infected with COVID and may infect others, and in that way incapacitates the individual to be able to conduct his or her work. But on the other hand, it's the operational requirement. The first one I mentioned is the right to individual choice, constitutional choice, and all of those other things that obviously people have. But that may render them incapable of doing their work because of the operational reasons. And so from the employer side, it's an operational reason. And they can terminate if they have good grounds to introduce mandatory vaccination for operational reasons, and that will out-trump the incapacity or the personal rights protection in favor of the greater good, the protection of all, as opposed to the protection of an individual who may risk the health of the rest.
Finally, what about if I refuse to be vaccinated on religious grounds? Would I need to show some form of proof? And will that stand up as far as my rights are concerned, my constitutional rights are concerned?
No, I don't think it's relevant in this situation because whatever those constitutional rights are, they recognize, whether it's religion, it's customary, or whatever, they are recognized. So you don't have to prove it. You can simply state, this is my belief, and you're entitled to state your belief and to be protected. But as I say, the standing by your belief in these circumstances, with the threat and everything we've discussed of the risks of infecting others, and the need for the employer to carry out its duty to protect all of its employees, that individual right, if we want to stand up for it, that individual, unfortunately, will have to face the consequences of that. And the consequence of that, one of them consequences of it, could be termination for operational requirements from the workplace.
Okay, that's really very, very clear. Thank you indeed, Labour Lawyer and Mediator, Deale Attorneys Patrick Deale, for clarifying all of that. Go well and have yourself a great day.
My pleasure. Thank you, Julie. Thank you.
8:48 exactly, news and views right here on Salam Media.